to Geared for Growth. I'm your host, Mike Mortlock from MCG Quantity Surveyors. Today we're talking all things property investing strategy. What is a property investing strategy, and is what you think a strategy actually really just a property investing tactic? To walk us all through it, we've got Azeem Rahman, who is not a property investment professional, just a property investor that's achieved some exceptional results, from purchasing his first property at the age of 24 all the way through some ups and downs. And he's generous enough to share some of his failures or areas that led him to understand that he doesn't have a strategy and how he can actually put that together. He gives us some guidance on how we should consider building a property investing strategy, the types of professionals that we should reach out to, and some red flags for industry people that talk about property investing strategy but is not necessarily worth the paper it's written on. Az is very generous with his property investing insights, and we have a great discussion about property investing strategy, why it's important, and how you can leverage that to achieve your property investing and financial goals. Here's Az. Azeem Rahman, thanks for joining me on Geared for Growth.
It's a pleasure to be here, Mike. I'm really excited to talk about, just before you hit the record button, we were just chatting about something that's really passionate to both of us and me personally. So very excited to be here and have a chat.
I think what might also excite some of the listeners is that you aren't a buyer's agent. You don't necessarily work in property. So that's quite a deviation from our normal guests. We're getting you on from the perspective of a property investor that's had some great success, but also had quite a few failures along the way, which you kind of pinned down on strategy. So I appreciate the humility to come on and say, look, I absolutely messed this up, but I think that really resonates with the listeners. Let's talk about going back to the beginning, when you first started investing in property. How old were you? What was your mindset? And was there a grand vision of what you wanted to achieve?
There was definitely no grand vision. It was a very myopic view at the time, which was saving up enough deposit to purchase an investment property, what that property would be and where it would be and how much it would cost and how much I could borrow. None of that was thought through. I just simply worked hard as a young, in my early 20s, to save enough deposit, which was close to just about $50,000 at the time. And as soon as I felt that it was enough and I was able to borrow sufficient funds, I did what most investors do, Mike, and they purchased in their own backyard, which is what I went and did. Yep. And off I went, purely just based on, do I have enough deposit saved? How much can I borrow the rest? 80%. And off I went. No grand vision. There was no plan. There was no thought around it. But as time went by, applying a continuous improvement mindset, I constantly was learning tactically on what was working well and what wasn't working well. But it was more still specific, tactical, operational, on the grounds in terms of the property itself, the property manager, the rent, how much it's growing, the location, negotiation. But it was all still very practical related. And the last leg of the piece that everyone looks at, which is property, and I was still within that last stage. But it wasn't as the years went by and I continued to focus on my education and really learning from mentors, that I started to understand, wait a minute, I've actually got this completely the wrong way around. I need to reverse engineer this and start with strategy. And I went down a rabbit hole to really understand, what does strategy actually mean and what does it look like? And hearing all the conversations with different people, both professionals in the industry, people that I knew were successful in their own portfolios that they had acquired as well too, and they were on the other side of that as well too, earning passive income. But then also my own corporate knowledge as well about, what does strategy actually mean? What does the plan actually mean? So kind of piecing that all together, fast forward 8 years later, I definitely have a much better understanding of what that is and what I could have done better when I first started off.
At what point did you realize, gosh, I really didn't have a plan and I need to rectify this situation? Was it with that first property that you kind of thought, gee, I've made some decisions here that could limit my future capacity? Or how do you define the moment in time where you're like, there's something missing?
It's probably about halfway through. So it wasn't until after a few property purchases where I was able to pause, pop the bonnet open, so to speak, and say, what am I actually doing here? Because I did have some micro wins along the way, but again, it was just purely based on the property purchases themselves and how they were performing. So it's probably about halfway through. So in terms of, just to give the audience a little bit of context, it was after the third property purchase, which is when it really started to sink in with me, because I still, despite the ability to do what most investors do, which is to pull out equity, put those funds towards the next property, and I was able to replicate that. I wasn't clear in my mind where I was going still. So it was at that third property purchase where I realized, okay, strategy is definitely missing in my piece of the journey.
And was it a matter of you're starting to hit your head on the ceiling with serviceability and finance, or you're just kind of thinking, okay, well, I've got these properties, they're going up in value, I'm pulling the equity and I'm getting more, but how do I actually turn this into the life that I want or the retirement outcome that I'm planning for?
It wasn't more the financial component that was still fairly strong at that point, which was great. It was more to do with diversification. So as the first property being within their own backyard, the other next weren't necessarily in directly within the backyard, so to speak, but they weren't as diverse as they should be when you're thinking about the fact that there's 15,000 suburbs across Australia.
Yep.
So that was the trigger point that made me think, well, if I need to have a portfolio, which is important for any investment asset class to diversify, how am I going to go about doing this, and what's that strategy going to look like? So that was the trigger point that led me down that path on the notion of strategy.
So let's talk property strategy 101. What does that actually mean, and what does an example, say, strategy look like for someone like yourself?
So to not overcomplicate it, the way I would look at what strategy means is an approach, right? So I would supplicate the word strategy for an approach. It's an approach that you're going to be taking for the long term to help you to achieve your property investment goals.
Yep.
And so that could be, generally speaking, minimum of 10 years, but ideally 15 years plus. And along that journey, there is a number of things that you first need to understand what that approach needs to be. So you first need to collect a lot of what I like to call data, which is quantitative and qualitative data, which is your input to then understand what the approach could look like. And of course, there's a lot here that we can unpack, but to really simplify it, there's two fundamental questions that you need to answer. One is, what's the desired future state? And number two, what's my current state? So in other words, where do I want to be and where am I right now? And within each of those questions, there is a ton of different data points that you need to understand and analyze, which then together, when you gel those two together, that helps you start to inform what the approach needs to actually look like. And so for myself and for a lot of people out there, the approaches don't really change that much, Mike. But it just depends on those inputs, as I mentioned. But for instance, an approach could look like your traditional buy and hold strategy, right? That is an approach. You could have a buy, hold, and renovate. You could have a flipping strategy. You could have looking at development opportunities. You could look at specifically building granny flats on subdivided land. Or your strategy could be purely purchasing vacant land and then building on that and then selling it off. So they're the broad approaches that you take. So it doesn't matter which property type you're selecting, which area it's going to be purchased in, and which the region it'll be. Those things don't matter. The approach still remains the same.
So, what are some of the common misconceptions about strategy? And I could even ask the question, the way that you describe it, where am I now? Where do I want to be? That doesn't sound very difficult. Why do you think investors aren't terribly sophisticated when they're talking about the strategy?
I think so. There's two parts to this question, right? So I think there is, firstly, from my personal experience, Mike, I think there are four key reasons why strategy is underrated and not perceived to have the importance as it should. So the four things that come to mind. The first is assumption. Every man and his dog in Australia will tell you, just go out there, buy a property, it'll go up in value, right?
Yep.
Wrong. It won't go up. It doesn't work like that. There are many cases, and I'm one of those, where you can purchase an investment property and actually it'll do the converse of what you think it's expected to do in terms of results. So because there is this general perception out there that our property always goes up in value, that assumption then doesn't allow people to have the mindset to think about strategy. So it's not even a forefront to your mind to think about strategy, because you're just already assuming that it's a simple case of 1 + 1 = 2. So assumption is one issue. The second is a lack of education, and we know that the statistics show that more than 70% or about 70% of Australians only hold one investment property, and that, if I'm not mistaken, that statistic hasn't changed for quite some time. And from those, half of them are sort of the accidental investors. So broadly speaking, in Australia, we don't have a lot of investors, private investors like myself, who are educated to understand the importance of strategy. The third reason is wrong people. And as well-intentioned family is and relatives are and friends and family, most of them should be thinking twice, if not multiple times, before they speak about property. And most of these people will not be giving you that advice. I certainly didn't get that advice from my family about the importance of strategy. And I dare say that that's also another reason. And lastly, my biggest bugbear is social media. I see a lot of professionals in the industry who are performing different roles, who talk about strategy, or they use quote unquote blueprint, which in actual fact is not helping the case for people who are trying to truly understand what a strategy really is. Because if you think about it, if you don't know much about building muscles, and you see someone on a video on YouTube, very confident, very eloquent, charismatic, knows how to carry themselves, you're easily going to be able to assume that, hey, this person in front of me knows exactly what they're talking about. But in actual fact, they're misguiding you, or they're giving you misrepresented information of what strategy really is. So those are some of the common reasons. In terms of the misconceptions, the 5 that come to my mind is, one, that strategy is developed overnight. It's not. It actually takes a lot of thinking, a lot of planning, a lot of reflecting, a lot of debating as well too, to really understand what your strategy needs to be and being committed to that strategy. And a couple other ones that come to mind is, again, these ones really, really frustrate me, is considering the location as the strategy. So I often see private investors say this as well as professionals, that, we've got a commercial strategy for our client, or we've got a residential strategy for our client, or my strategy is this. That's just purely the location, or the sub,
or the asset type, right?
That's right. It's the sub market that which you're looking to invest in, where you're going to be executing a strategy. That isn't the strategy. And for those people, just to get to sort of use the analogy of fitness to help you understand how silly it can sound, it's like an individual saying, I've got a goal to lose 10 kilos. My strategy is to go to the park and lose those 10 kilos. But that's just the location. You could lose the 10 kilos by going to the gym. You could lose the 10 kilos by working out at home. You could lose the 10 kilos by going to an indoor fitness center. That's a location. It's not the actual strategy. And the one that follows very closely to that is negatively geared strategy or a positively geared strategy. Again, those are not strategies. That's just purely the final result.
Yeah, the tax outcome, right, rather than a strategy.
Exactly. So those are a few of the misconceptions that are out there around that piece, and I think another one is tactics as well. So there's a lot of confusion between thinking that a tactic is a strategy. They're both very important. They're both very different things. They go hand in hand. But again, I see that often misconstrued for strategy.
Yeah, and I suppose tactics can be a great thing. You might have a tactic of, this is how we negotiate, and typically we get 10% off the listed price or what have you. And there's a time and place for tactics, right? But strategy is a broader thing over a longer time horizon, would you say?
Absolutely. I think I was actually talking to a good friend of mine the other day, and they were talking about their plans in property investing, and they were asking for my thoughts. And I said, well, what you're talking about here are tactics, and they're not to do with strategy. And they ask, what do you mean? And I was really struggling to explain it. So I used an analogy, and I said to them, imagine that you can see a mountain. And in order for you to get to the top of the mountain, you can see there are 8 different paths that can take you there. And based on your situation, your age, your physical strength, your mental strength, your spirituality, the gear that you've got available, the equipment that you've got, the previous experience you have with mountain climbing, you decide that this is the particular path that's best for me to get there. Now, the steps you take on the path are your tactics. There may be times where your steps may be easily paced. There may be times where you start to power walk. There may be times where you go, oh shit, the sun's about to go down. I want to actually cover more ground, so I'm going to pick up the pace and run. And there'll be other times where you say, I'm just going to pause and rest and camp out, or it's getting steep, so you slow down your steps. But your path is still the same, but the tactics you're taking there along the way, they're the ones that change as well too. And that's why they're important, because if you use that analogy, as I was explaining to my friend, was if you didn't take those steps, you're not going to get any closer to the mountain, even though you've selected your path. So they go very hand in hand. And also, if you start to walk without knowing which path you're taking, then you're walking aimlessly. And who knows if you're going in the right direction as well too. So they're definitely very, very important.
Yeah, no, absolutely agree. And that's a really, really good analogy. Let's walk through the key steps in actually formulating a strategy. Where should we start? What does that look like? What can you do to guide people who are kind of thinking, gee, I'm hearing a bit of myself here. I've definitely got a plan of how to buy property that appreciates in value. I might have some tactics, but I don't really have a strategy per se.
There is a lot here. There's a lot to unpack here. So I'll do my best to summarize this and keep it brief. But to begin with, the best way to think of it is you need some initial input to understand what the approach would look like. So a couple of things I mentioned at the start. So what's your future desired state? That's your starting point. And from my experience, Mike, and we were talking about this a little bit offline too, that had I spent the time to do this, I probably wouldn't have pulled the trigger so early at the age of 24. Because if you do this part well, it should actually take you the longest time to crystallize in your mind and then also put it down on paper to understand why are you doing this in the first place? What's the long-term vision? What are the goals that you want to achieve? And not just your quantitative goals that we all talk about growth and passive income, but what are the non-financial goals that you're trying to achieve and why? And what does that actually look like and taste and feel like? And what are the actual timeframes that you're looking to achieve? So your future state is definitely one component. And then we've got your second stage, which is your current state itself. So the current state is predominantly everything to do with your financials. You know, what's your current income and expenses? What's the surplus or deficit that's in place? If you do have an existing investment property, what's the current cash flow position of that investment property? What's your overall net worth when you take into consideration your assets and your liabilities? Your borrowing capacity, what does that actually look like? And then the next stage as part of your strategy should then cover off your risk tolerance. And again, that's a bit of a buzzword that you hear these days, but when you really break down risk tolerance, that's actually got 3 different components to it. There's the inherent risk of real estate itself. There's the risk of the type of property that you'll purchase. And then there's the biggest risk of all, which is you, the individual. Which is the biggest risk, and what's your appetite, what's your personality like, how much risk are you willing to take, how much knowledge and experience do you have with real estate to be able to take on the certain level of risk that you think you may be able to take. So your risk tolerance is another component. And then we come to the actual approach itself, and the way that I've personally done this, there's no right or wrong, but I typically have a primary approach, and then parallel to that is a secondary approach, which may come in handy later down the track in the next 5 years plus after you've started to execute on your primary approach and strategy. But your secondary strategy can start to come into play a little bit later down the track. And then flowing on from that, you'll have a think about what are the ownership structures that you need to take into consideration, the pros and cons, the specific areas that you might be considering, your purchase range, the type of property that you'll be looking at, and then your roadmap. And your roadmap is essentially your projections, and it's a projection of not just the number of properties you need to achieve and by when, but also what is the specific cash flow affordability analysis for the property as well too. And depending on how you like to do it, some people like to also include the exit strategy as part of that formulation. Other times I've seen certain people believe that exit strategy is a separate component to come back and revisit later. But broadly speaking, these are the the key buckets that you need to take into consideration and put down on paper to develop your strategy.
There might be some people listening thinking, okay, well, as I was saying, when he was 24 and he bought his first property, had he known what he knows now, he probably wouldn't have done it. And they might say, well, what if that took him a year or two to figure out? That's a year or two he's not in the property market and all property goes up, which obviously you've sort of debunked firsthand to some degree. Is there kind of like an opportunity cost? Is there a negative to getting started on a path and backfilling the strategy? Or do you feel like it's got to be the first tenant and the first sort of step on the road to what you're trying to do? The Geared for Growth Property Investing podcast is presented by our business, MCG Quantity Surveyors. If you're an investor or a property professional looking to get the best tax depreciation deductions for yourself or your clients, please get in touch with us at mcgqs.com.au. It's our mission to help as many property investors as we can to maximise their claims and maximise their property education as well.
It's a good question, Mike, because one could argue, and it is a good question, that the time that's spent, will this actually derail me from actually being able to go ahead? But the truth is, it's a simple case of going one step back in order to go two steps forward. So if I use the analogy of fitness, because I really enjoy fitness, if I don't have a clue about how to actually build muscle, it's worth the time to actually research, educate myself before I go forward. Because guess what? Because with the right nutrition, with the right diet, and with the right form when I'm exercising, I'm actually going to be better off in the long term, because I'm actually going to be sustaining my health, my body, and preventing any injuries from happening along the way. So it's a short-term pain for long-term gain. Is the way to look at it. And the same goes with property. The reality is, in order to develop and put all this down on paper to have a clear strategy, yes, it does take time. But there are two things that I would say for those that are out there that are thinking about this is, one, if you're very clear on why you're doing this in the first place, that fire inside you will be enough for you to carve out the time that's required to develop your strategy. And two, if you don't have that time, there are some really good independent professionals out there who can assist you to do it, and it's worth paying someone the right level to get the service that you need and support to fast track it if you don't have that time as well too. So there are a couple of ways around it to avoid your opportunity cost as well too. But beyond that as well too, I think it's important just to have abundance mindset. Yes, you can't deny black and white that the Perth market has gone up a lot since post-COVID. You can't deny those things, but you need to have an abundance mindset and say, guess what? If I didn't get into the market at this point in time, or I still haven't purchased, that's okay. Have that belief that there is something out there. And I know that's a little bit separate to looking at it from a logical perspective, but I think putting these things aside, if you are planning about strategy, or if you're worried or spending investing this time is actually going to I'm going to miss out on opportunities, you need to rewire your brain and think about having an abundance mindset for the long term.
Yeah. And optimizing the outcome of those opportunities that present themselves as well, I guess. I want to get to this section of the show where, unfortunately, it's kind of salt in the wounds time. We want to know about some of these failures, and maybe we can frame them in the context of, was this a particular favor that led you towards strategy because you felt you were bereft of it? Or if it was during a strategic kind of phase, how did it kind of implement a reevaluation of the strategy? So hopefully we've got maybe one on each side.
So when it comes to the triggers and the learnings themselves, there were quite many. Of course, which is, my failures are nothing that are rare. They're fairly common. So to begin with, not having the right people around me, the right advice, and the right planning. So they're the common things that were missing there. But I think when I look back, and despite those failures, and if I had my time again, I wouldn't purchase a few of those properties. What I was fortunate enough was that I hadn't maxed out on my borrowing capacity with those purchases, and the cash flow was fairly okay at the time. So I think, I think God had His hand over me, which I was quite fortunate and blessed to play that way. But that doesn't take away from the fact that those challenges persisted. But upon further reflection, when I think about the root cause issue, it actually stemmed from the education piece. Because had I spent more time educating myself with the right content, both paid and unpaid, it would have led me earlier to realize the importance of strategy, which I now know from absorbing a lot of information. So I think the education was correct, the right education, because the right education later on, which triggered me to explore this further, pointed me towards the importance of the strategy. So that was critical. And I think how this started to manifest and implement itself was a combination of what I was seeing and what I was hearing out there in the market about what a strategy is, and seeing what was resonating with me and what wasn't resonating with me, with some of those misconceptions that I shared with you earlier. But then also applying my own professional experience to it as well too, and saying, okay, well, I think this is what it needs to look like. And to begin with, what I did was I implemented my strategy based on my own understanding. And then I've gone ahead and actually verified that with professionals in the industry as well too, which was amazing. And it was a great thing to do, because there was already a lot of legwork that I had done in putting this down on paper. But I still had a lot of gaps, and those gaps got filled by the professionals as well too, which was excellent. And I definitely needed it.
Yep. Can you give some examples of, say, decisions that you might have made pre-strategy that you can observe, okay, well, my strategy actually leads me away from that particular decision? So something that may have been attractive to you in the beginning of your investing sort of process, to something later on that you can sort of point to that strategy actually stopped me from buying that particular property or making that sort of decision.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first property was a great example. It was more focused on being what would be described as a cash flow central property. So from a cash flow point of view, fantastic. From a capital growth point of view, absolutely not. And had my strategy been developed earlier on in the journey at that point in time, again, with understanding of, well, what's my future state look like? Why do I want to achieve this? And how is property going to help me to get there in the time frame that I want? It would have been very clear to me that the focus needs to be capital growth. And yes, I may need to be able to actually dip into my pockets and put forward a little bit. But guess what? If the right property is selected and the right location at the right time or around the right time, it will actually offset the amount that I'm having to put in year on year for a period of time, because of the growth that's needed. And that growth is needed to achieve the longer term goals that I'm working towards. So that's one example that comes to mind from the first property, because had I had that realization back then, I would not have gone down that path at all to begin with. So that's one. The other one that comes to mind as well too then is from a land tax perspective as well too. So again, as we were talking earlier, you think about ownership structures, and they all have their pros and cons. But again, when you look at those pros and cons, not just with the short-term view, but the long-term view, and had I done that with a long-term view, I would have realized, wait a minute, it's actually not worthwhile to purchase this in my own name. I should think about purchasing this in a different entity. Or if not, at least consider what are the other states and better opportunities as well to minimize land tax. So a couple of those things would have been completely moved. Fortunately enough, because, as I said earlier, because the borrowing capacity wasn't constraint, it didn't cause any hindrance for me to continue, but it certainly delayed. There's no doubt about that. It certainly delayed, because, as we know, cash flow property doesn't give you the growth that you need in the long term. So it definitely has delayed. It didn't derail, but definitely delayed. And I think that goes to show the importance that it doesn't always necessarily need to be derailing you, but it can certainly delay you as well too. And for someone myself, I'm a little bit more fortunate, I'm a bit younger. But again, it just goes to show the importance of getting this right if you're starting a little bit later in life.
Yeah, if you feel like you're in your 40s or your 50s and your investment horizon is a little bit shorter than someone in their 20s, it's because it is, but all the more reason to make the right steps so that you can get to where you want to be faster, right? Because you don't have that much time to play with.
No, you don't, and it's again, you could have two people and they could have the same goals that they need to achieve, but one could be at the age of 40 and one could be the age of 20, and the approach that they'll need to take and the action that they need to take will be vastly different. Which is why, again, that's why the strategy is so important.
Land tax is a good example of something that can pop up. Obviously, we had land tax legislation changes in Queensland for a bit, in Melbourne for a long time, allegedly 10 years, but I think it might go a little bit longer than that. It begs the question, what kind of external shocks or influences would force you to rethink the strategy? And just in a generic sense, is there an exact sort of key time that a strategy should be reassessed or redeveloped, i.e. every 2 or 3 years we should look at it and see how we're tracking and maybe make some changes based on where we're at or what's happening in the economy or the property market?
So when it comes to the triggering of your strategy and how often you should look at it, from what I've seen out there, textbook responses will typically tell you should look at reviewing your strategy every 12 months. But from my own personal experience, I think 18 months is a good sweet spot. Mm-hmm. Because what I found is, yes, in all of our lives, generally speaking, there'll always be a change of some sort. But it may not necessarily be what I would, in my eyes, refer to as a significant change. But for me personally, within an 18-month period since I've been investing in property till now, I've noticed that within an 18-month time frame, there's always a significant change. So I would recommend a review 18 months because it gives you that opportunity a little bit more. If nothing's really happened, I'm fairly confident something will definitely pop up in another 6 months' time. And broadly speaking, the key triggers that will pop up is to do with your home, your family, your health, and your income. So when it comes to home, where it could be you're looking to move out of home, you're looking to move back in home, you're looking to move away from renting and purchase your first PPOR, or you're looking to upgrade, or you're looking to downgrade. So there's a lot of things that could be triggering that space there for you. When it comes to family, you could be looking to get into a relationship. You might be getting a divorce. Sadly, you might be getting into a separation. You may be having children, or your children have grown up now and now you become empty nesters. So there's a lot of things that can happen in that space. Income is a really, really big one because most of us have constantly changes happening in the income space. So again, it could be a job loss. It could be a promotion, which has driven an increase in your salary. It could be a side hustle that's giving you a little extra pocket money there. Or sometimes that side hustle has actually grown out and it's time to scale as well too. Or one of you, if you have a family, you may be considering to go part-time for other commitments as well too. So there's a range of things that can happen in the income space. And the one thing that can't be really expected is health. So things can happen all the time, and health is one of those where unexpected things can happen. And I know firsthand, for example, there was a couple that I was speaking to a couple of weeks back, and they had about $200,000 set aside in an offset account, which was off the back end of selling a previous property. They were looking to reinvest that, but they wanted to ensure that they kept it for a rainy day reserve. And unfortunately, their mother became very, very ill. And so without a blink of an eye, without having to think, they were able to spend the money they needed to on flights to get over there and spend the time they needed to with their mother. And that's an example where shit can just hit the fan, and what that'll do is everything will just fall to the side, and that includes your property investing journey and strategy will need to take a pause for the unexpected things that can happen with health for you or your family.
Yep, I love that. I want to take a minute to talk about people that you referenced earlier. There's no shortage of charismatic people on social media that are, let's say they've got the big muscles. They can spend more on steroids than you can afford, but
you can't.
No. I need a wider angle, but it does look like you lift. But there's all sorts of people out there that will talk about, look, we're going to help you with a strategy. They might be buyer's agents, for example, but they're talking about the strategy and how they can help you develop a strategy. And you've talked about the importance of doing the work yourself, of course, but leaning on experts in that space. How do you identify an expert, or are there some red flags or some common phrases that make you kind of believe this is maybe not an expert in creating a property investing strategy? They might just be more of a hot spotter or a general buyer's agent.
Generally speaking, I would stay away from anyone who's offering to develop a strategy for you, which is essentially not their primary service. So your buyer's agents are a great example, and so are project marketers who are selling off the plan apartments and house and land packages.
Yeah.
That's their service offering. That's their core offering. Strategy development is not their core offering, and so I think that's the general rule of thumb: is always think about the person that you're dealing with or the company you're dealing with, what's their core service offering? If strategy is not one of them, then that is something to be very aware of to begin with. But specifically, the time, process, involvement, and cost, they're the four key red flags to think about when you're engaging with these people. And I'll break these down. So number one, time. From everything we've just discussed so far right now, Mike, you know, it's very clear that when you're looking to develop a strategy, it doesn't happen overnight. It requires a lot of planning and discussion. So if anyone is planning to schedule one-off a 45-minute strategy session with you and develop a plan for you, that should be a red flag for you, because it cannot be, in order to do it justice, it cannot be done in one seating or two seating sessions with a professional. It requires much more time and effort. And from my experience, both personally and dealing with professionals, if you have the commitment with the professionals, they've got the capacity to help you, and you don't have to spend a lot of time waiting. At a bare minimum, with full-time commitment towards it, you're looking at least 3 weeks to actually put this in place. So time is one thing. Process, if it's a simple couple of steps in the process and then bang, we're going to share with you a really nice and well-polished PDF, which is put together by our marketing team, that's going to be another red flag as well too. A lot of these documents that I've seen firsthand, they're quite generic. They're not specific to your individual needs and circumstances. And you'll start to see that in the document itself, how much of this is generic and how much of this is actually relevant and personable to my situation. The involvement is another piece as well too. So if you have a one-stop shop per company, so to speak, or a person or an agency, that's a red flag. And for those who are listening or watching for this, think about it not as a consumer, but think about it from a business point of view. If you were in their shoes and you've got an in-house an accountant, a financial planner, potentially a buyer's agent as well too, a mortgage broker, what are the chances that these individuals who are colleagues to each other are going to disagree with one another and say, wait a minute, that's not right. So they're all on the same page. They're all singing from the same hymn book. And that's a red flag for you, because neither one of them are likely to be put forward something that's going to contradict what the other individual is saying. Whereas when you're dealing with independent people, you'll start to see that it'll actually confuse you. You'll start to see it'll actually make you question certain things and say, wait a minute, Mike said this to me, but my broker was saying this. Hey, Mike, I don't understand this because broker was saying X, Y, and Z to me. What does that mean? Can you help me understand that? So it will allow that opportunity for those type of questions. And I actually personally think it's a good thing to be confused, whereas what this one-stop shop solution will do, they'll try to position it as convenience and simple for you, where in actual fact, that's actually alarm bells in my head. And the last thing is cost. A good, well-developed personal strategy that is not just words, but actually put down on paper, paying for that and getting somebody to assist you with that, especially professional, are worth their weight in gold. If anyone is offering it to you for free, that's a big red flag.
I love that. As to put a bit of a bow in this episode, I'd love to hear, as much as you're willing to share, about your journey, where you got to from 24 and your first property around the corner to where you're at today, what your strategy is for the life that you're trying to achieve. And there's obviously an opportunity to weave in any gold along the way.
So I think I was sharing this with you earlier as well too, that I started this at the age of 24. And there has been some good achievements and successes along the way, but by far, much more than that, there's been a lot of challenges and learnings along the way. So when I think about my strategy is quite plain, simple, and boring, which is a traditional buy and hold, along with a secondary strategy, which I would look to implement a little bit later down the track, which would be to do more renovation work, and not your cosmetic, but more strategic style of renovation. And I'll continue to be on this journey for the foreseeable future. I would say at least for the next 10 years, so to speak. I generally don't like to think that far ahead. For me personally, I like to break it down into the next 12 to 18 months, because you really don't know what's going to happen next, and planning that far ahead looks great on the spreadsheet and on the PowerPoint, but it doesn't always play out that way. So that's where I'm heading at the moment. And in terms of thoughts and ideas that I would share with anyone out there who's can relate to me and is on a similar journey or is about to start their journey, is if you don't have a strategy, I highly recommend that you do have one in place. And if you're going to be doing it yourself, great. Make sure, though, that you document it, because you would be surprised and also amazed at how powerful it can be when you have actually something to look at. Visuals are very powerful, right? So you would be amazed to see what that can do for you, because it gives you something to look at and reflect on and say, okay, what's working well, what's not working well? Am I disciplined on this journey? Am I not? And what pivots do I need to make? And the other piece of thought that I would give is, if you're not able to do it yourself because you're not comfortable you're doing it correctly, then get the right assistance from independent people to assist you. And lastly, something that came up in a conversation the other day with someone was our beautiful and ever-growing ChatGPT and AI. If you're thinking that can be the right source to help you develop an investment strategy, please think again. And what I asked this individual to think about, and I would ask people to think too, is if you can name just two people who used ChatGPT to develop a property investment strategy, use that strategy to go purchase a property, and that property has performed well. If you can just name two people who've done that, I'll rest my case. But if you can't name two people who've done it on the back end of ChatGPT, stick to the professionals who actually have experience on Earth.
Yeah, I love that one, because we talked about, there's no shortage of experts out there sharing their quote unquote wisdom, and that's really the hunting ground that ChatGPT has to do its own research and analysis, right? So it's almost like garbage in, garbage out has to be mentioned in that equation. As we've covered off a heap of territory today, I want to say thank you for sharing so openly your thoughts around strategy and where it's worked well for you and what you think property investors are missing. So thank you very much for sharing all that with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Mike.
Cheers.